Liaising with parents, professionals and next schools as well for transition is quite important. The SENCO should, I hope, have a really good idea about the needs that the individual children within the school are, and can explain those and liaise with the next school, the next provision, if it's secondary transfer, for instance, and explain the sort of support that that child's going to need. I think that's a really sort of key part of the SENCO's role, really, is knowing that child well enough. And work with the head and governors on reasonable adjustments. That's something that comes up quite a lot when we're dealing with schools, what reasonable adjustments are made, and we'll talk about that a bit further. And access arrangements, so for instance, extra time examinations, or what sort of other sort of benefits they can support the child with. And keeping school SEN records. Who decides what SEN support my child has? So we've got, okay, the SENCO's pretty much going to be quite involved, but who decides on it? So if you think that your child may need SEN support, and it sounds like we may already be beyond that point with you, if you think your child might need SEN support, talk first of all to the form teacher or the head of year from your secondary, and or the SENCO. Otherwise, what the SENCO in practice says, teachers and leadership team oversee assessments of progress for all pupils. So then they look at all the progress that all the pupils are making, and then the school then decides, so this team here will then decide if the child needs SEN support, and then hopefully talk to you, tell you if they're going to be making provision or what they're putting in place to try and help. If you're not happy about the support you have, you can talk to the SENCO or the deputy head, or you can come and have a chat with us, and you can vent all your frustrations if you feel that you're not getting anywhere or not being listened to, or things aren't going well. Then we can help, and we can help with that process too, to talk about things aren't going so well. So the graduated approach that we talked about, the assess, plan, do, review, should take action to, the schools should take action to remove barriers to learning, and that's a big one that's comes up quite frequently, is that's what as parents and that's what as schools actually really want, is removing the barriers to their learning. What is it that's stopping them from learning? Okay, and put effective SEN provision in place for them. So, and schools must provide aids and services. So if you have physical disabilities, so the aids, things like that might come in, and services to prevent the child being disadvantaged. Reasonable adjustments is another one that gets mentioned quite frequently. What reasonable adjustments are they making for that child? So for example, a child with ADHD, they might call out inappropriately. They might. I'm not sort of saying what all the the symptoms of ADHD might be, but they might call out in class. So would it be a reasonable adjustment that actually the teacher knows that that child might call out, and not have them stormed up at the front of the class and you're not allowed to do that, the school is. So I see that a little bit as flexibility with the school rules, but accommodating.
They punish my son for shouting out against.
They punish for shouting out. Yeah, I think that's quite frequent.
Really.
That's an understanding that needs to happen across the board with everyone that's dealing with your child. Is it's a reasonable adjustment that actually, if he's shouting out because disability and things that can be difficult for kids with ADHD, what reasonable adjustments can they make? And that's something that's good to have a conversation about, because sometimes the inflexibility within schools can be really difficult for parents, I think, and where they just don't seem to want to understand in some cases that this child has additional needs actually, and there's things that they can't help. And so the school rules need to apply, but we need to apply them flexibly, and what can we do? So reasonable adjustments covers a lot of things, but I think in terms of ADHD, you can probably think of instances when you've had that call or that letter or that email and think, oh, but he's got ADHD or she's got ADHD, why have they not allowed for that? So sort of punishment comes in. So reasonable adjustments is quite a big one. Like for instance, then it might be that actually if your child's frustrated or they're having a hard time, that they can remove themselves then and be allowed to, and not somebody saying, where are you going? But if it's agreed in advance, I think that's a key part as well. If it's agreed in advance, a reasonable adjustment could be, actually, I need just 2 minutes outside the door because I'm feeling stressed, I'm anxious, I'm getting worked up and I'm calling out, I just need to take myself outside. And that's, you know, a good place to be. Then it's a positive thing, and I'll come back in and I'm ready to learn again.
What about if they use a reasonable adjustment for when a child with ADHD calls out, or the child does it again, and then the child is given detention? Because that's what happens to my son every day.
And I'm sure it happens frequently, yes.
So they say they have this reasonable adjustment, but he calls out again and again.
Well, he's going to keep
Then
doing
it's
it.
not working, and then we've got to look at what the
Yeah.
sensation is, because then the reasonable adjustment isn't working.
They need to do something.
We need to come back and review it and then, okay, well, what is going to work?
So
Because
even
clearly
though-
that, as a system, isn't working for your child, so the SEND provision, they have to use their best endeavours to make sure that what they're putting in place is working, but it's not
Can they
working.
keep giving them detentions again and again and again when their adjustments aren't working?
The onus is always put on the child to change, not.
Right.
That's
That is
where the
what
pressure
happens.
is.
Yeah.
Is on the child
I
to
think
change.
that's a huge problem, actually. I think that's it. You can have reasonable adjustments, but it's not just a glib, oh well, it's fine. It has to work. And it has to be
There's nothing to stop
within the
them
agreement.
punishing when the reasonable adjustment doesn't work.
Well,
Then you could talk about
discrimination then
You're
would
actually
come in, I think,
discriminating
yeah.
against that child by you'll do so much, but then actually when we get to a certain level, and if when your child is not behaving within the confines of the reasonable adjustments that have been made, then those aren't working, and we need to look at them again and make other ones. So I think it's a case of it, you know, on an individual basis, but I'm sure that's something you might be familiar with, is that you know, you do get that phone call and, oh well, he's got detention today, she's got detention today for calling out, and they did it 4 times in a lesson. Well, we need to do something else then, because clearly allowing them to call out once and then not doing anything about it that might be a reasonable adjustment. If they do it 3 more times, then that's not working. So then we need to look at the provision. What do we do next? And that's a discussion with the school where, you know, as parents, it's perhaps for you to think about. We'll talk about that a little bit further on, about how parents can have an influence on what happens and how we actually make those. What should the reasonable adjustments look like? Okay, so the sort of things that we're talking about when we're saying about SEND support and what that might look like. Small group work, so it might be taking a group of children out. A special learning programme, so specific things that the school have bought in or called in to use. That they might have somebody, it might be the SENCO, it might be a TA, it might be a teacher, it might be a trained teacher that will sort of implement that. Extra help from the teacher or learning support assistant. Material or equipment. Observing and recording, so it might be seeing how that child is in a certain setting and are there behaviours that they're repeating but the reasonable adjustments aren't working from. They might be, you know, they might actually take that as something to do, part of their assessment of the situation. Peer support, so sometimes that happens particularly more in primary school, I would say, generally, but they might have a child who has an understanding of their friend and can actually help. I think it would be dangerous for the school to rely on that, because I don't necessarily think that's helpful, but certainly from the teaching point of view, that can be useful, is actually have children that can help another child or support or work together with. But it's, you know, down to individuals and down to the peers that they choose that would be appropriate for them or not. Specialist help, so the educational psychologist or other therapists. The SENCO might call in the educational psychologist to come and help, or have an assessment of the child or young person, and help with physical and personal care. Might also be part of that as well. So it can, but that's not, you know, limited to that. That could be, you know, in addition to that, different things. But yeah, I think those are things that they might, if there was SEND support in a school, it might fit into one of those categories. Now, for me, certainly with the parents that I help that are having difficulties with the school and when we have meetings, a lot of the time it's communication is a huge issue. Mostly often because the parents don't understand what the school are actually doing for the child, or the fact that it's not working, and so, you know, how can we use communication to try and improve the relationships if things aren't working so well, or at the beginning when you're trying to work out what the SEND support is going to look like for your child, what can we actually do? So, to my mind, it's the key to getting your child help that they need is actually communicating. You know your child the best of anyone in the world. You know what makes them tick and things they have. You understand how ADHD affects them, and that's huge. There'll be things that you are already doing to manage the ADHD, and I'm sure Val's groups and the support groups would agree that you already have strategies in place that are working. Might not work all the time. There might be difficulties at home with managing certain things, but you know them best and you love them like nobody else will love them. So it's really good if you can impart that to the school, but in a positive way. So I've put the arrow going both ways at the school. Basically, what do the school want? What do the school want for your child that's got special education needs, got ADHD? What do they want? They want to manage behaviour. And by that I don't just mean the impulsivity and behaviour that gets them into trouble, but also withdrawn behaviours or non-engagement behaviours. And that's so when I say manage behaviour, I'm talking generally about almost conformity, but in terms of what a school would want. They want a class that's easy to manage and all the individuals within the class are learning and sitting nicely and getting on with their work. So that's what the schools are looking for. The school wants to remove barriers to learning because they need the children to make progress and to learn. So I'm making the assumption that the school want the children to learn and they want barriers to learning, to their learning to be gone. That would be their ideal. And they must use their best endeavours to ensure that the pupils' needs are met. So that's what they should be doing on a daily basis, is things in place to make sure that the pupils' needs are met. So in terms of how those can cross over, if you have good communication with the school and someone in the school, it would usually be the SENCO, so I'll talk about that a bit more. But if it's not the SENCO, I find it's sometimes useful if you have a relationship with somebody else that's not necessarily the SENCO. If things aren't going well or you don't have that relationship or you're finding it difficult, sometimes the deputy head can be involved. Sometimes actually the form teacher will have enough say and sort of overall influence to make sure that the SEND provision is right for your child. So I think part of it is looking at what the school want for your child and what you want, and how those two can be blended together so that actually you're imparting your knowledge and empowering yourself, that actually the school will take on the benefit of your wisdom and experience with your own child, and using that and then using strategies and things that work for you. And that's where we want to get to, a point that actually the school are listening and they will take things on board and talk about what provision that they can do and what they can change when things are not working. So always try to keep sending him out the lesson because he won't sit still, or he's sort of calling out and we don't know what to do. Let's have a conversation about that and see. Well, at home, if I give him a 3-stage warning, that really helps, because then he knows that he's going beyond. You can't go from 0 to 60 in 5 seconds and then expect a child with ADHD just to conform and stop doing whatever it is they're doing if they have the impulsivity and difficulties. So where communication is two-way, schools can benefit from your insight into your child's behaviour and their emotional needs, of course, because anxiety and things are just really difficult to deal with. And hopefully you benefit from a child who actually feels engaged in their own education. So I think it's important to involve them in that process as well. But certainly in terms of where they are when they're getting SEND support in school, the first thing is meet with the SENCO. Meet with the teacher as well if you can, if it's primary school. In secondary, perhaps the head of year, somebody that should know the children and what lessons they're having. Or meet with an alternative person, so sometimes a deputy head or an inclusion manager who's not a SENCO, depending on the size of the school. There's sort of different titles for people. So you've got, the SENCO, that's that role, but there's sometimes an inclusion manager, and sometimes just having a relationship with someone else can actually move things forward better if things aren't going so well. And plan for the meeting. So I'm a good one for empowering parents to think about what it is that you actually want to get from the meeting. So at this point, certainly you can have a vent with us, ring us up and tell us what's going wrong, get it all out and say, you know, your frustrations if things are not going well, I'm not being listened to, nothing's changing, what can I do? Vent with us, and then sit down and plan for the meetings, and we can try and help you do that as well. What is it that you want to actually get from the meeting? Because sometimes it's just, do you know what, I just want to tell you that I'm really unhappy and frustrated with how you've been dealing with my child, that you're not meeting their needs, but what is it that you actually want them to do? Well, I want to sit down and talk about the strategies that are in place for him or her and why those aren't working. So let's list them. Let's actually have a list, because I think for schools, having the whole emotional thing where you're sharing, this is so frustrating for me, and my child's really unhappy, doesn't want to come to school, or whatever's going on. What can the school do? And I think it's actually quite empowering for parents to think about in advance of a meeting like that. What do I want to come away with? What would my son or daughter want me to come away with? You know, what is it that I could get the school's agreement on about how we're going to deal with the issues? What can we actually do? So making a plan, I think, is really important. What are the issues? Actually, let's talk about, is it non-compliance? Is it defiance? Is it calling out? Is it getting up and walking out? What is the actual problem? What's the nub of it, really? And how are the school approaching it now? What are they actually doing now? And what changes can we make to that? Now, I think it's difficult for a parent, because you are sitting across from somebody that's the school, and the school are telling you. So if the school are telling you, they must know. But I think what you want to try and get to is a point where you feel listened to. That's not always easy, but that's, I think if you have action plan, that will only help, because that's something that they have to then say, well, we're not going to do that. So I think presenting something that is practical and can work on the ground level, can work today. What practical solutions can help the situation right now? So if you said, well, if they're allowed to just walk out for 2 minutes, if they call out once and then they're allowed to step outside for 2 minutes, that would solve the problem. They just get over anxious and are calling out again, outside 2 minutes and then come back in. That's something that could happen in the next lesson. And how are they going to be implemented? And then, obviously, as part of that meeting, how are we going to measure whether that's working? Are we going to, let's arrange for another meeting in 6 weeks' time, or 4 weeks' time, or 2 weeks' time, depending the level of what's gone wrong and how it can be fixed. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about the funding for SEN and how that works. So what we've got here is how the help that your children can get in school is going to be funded, and how that leads on to what Cecille will talk about further, is the EHCP. So at the start, for every bum on a seat, every child sitting at a desk, there's an age-weighted pupil unit that's decided nationally and then at government and then at local government level about what each pupil's place in that school, in a mainstream maintained school, is worth, and that has a value. Every child gets that. That pays for the teachers and the books and the pencils and the playground and the library books and all that kind of stuff. So that's for every child. We've got pupil premium there as well, so children at a disadvantage that are eligible for free school meals and need extra help, we've got a little bit of extra funding coming in there for them, which is dealt with separately. Then we come to what SEN support looks like and who pays for that. So the local authority provide a SEN budget, also called the notional budget, and it's a pot of money that comes into the school. There's a whole, what's the word, like a framework.
Funding formula.
Funding formula, thank you. There's a funding formula about how the school gets
Excel
that.
spreadsheet with lots of boxes.
Yeah. that basically determines what that school will get in terms of their budget. So here's your pot of money, and that's for your SEN support there. So all the children with SEN in the school, they've got one pot that they're taking a share from. Now the school have different ways of dealing with that, and that's part of the SENCO's role and the head and the governor's role. What are we going to do with our SEN budget? Because it's just for those children that have special educational needs and disabilities within the school. So often what might happen, for example, they might get a specialist TA in, or they might get a TA and train that person to look after children with social communication difficulties or self-expression difficulties, and they might take them out every half an hour on a Wednesday afternoon after lunch, and from across the school potentially, and a child might be in a group of 6 other children, and that TA will be paid for by that SEND budget in the school. They might have a specialist teacher that comes in that they employ that usually covers more than one child, depending on the needs, or it might be one-to-one support if there's a higher level of needs that the child actually needs one-to-one. More common in primary schools, because I think that the general feeling is from the local authority that it's harder to have one-to-one in secondary schools because the kids don't want it. But that's another issue. So that's what can be provided. It's basically within this notional budget or the SEND budget. Now, when you have a child that has a higher level of need that can't be met just by this bit, so the group work and the additional things that they've put in place, and the taking out at break times if they're having hard time, and a TA that sits with them during assembly, all those kind of things that they might be paying for out of the SEND budget that school are paying for. If that's not enough and the school feel and you feel that's not enough, you might apply for an EHCP, which Cecille will talk more detail about. The funding from this EHCP tops up what the school does. It's not, here you go, you're doing away with the SEND budget for your child, and we're giving you a whole big bag of money separately. It's not, it's a top-up, and I think sometimes that's hard to sort of get your head around.
So if all of that hasn't worked and there are still episodes of, the frustration, if the learning is not happening at a rate that, the teachers and your child and yourself are happy about, there are still things, further provision that can be put in place. So you've had all those meetings with the SENCO, you've tried to communicate, and things are still not going forward. In the code of practice, there is then the system, which is the next step, which is to attain kind of the provision for your specific child that's legally binding by the local authority. There are 4 broad areas of need that are quite important. That means that learning has to happen in all those terms. Cognition and learning, so that's memory, with ADHD it's quite different. Processing of information, like for example, speed, writing speed also, that would go there. There is social and emotional needs. They are part of the curriculum, they are part of learning, and they can be barriers to that type of learning. Language and interaction, so word retrieval, being able to think of that, 5 words, 5 color words or whatever, that's part of that. And sensory and physical, so that makes sense, but also sensory processes, with ADHD, being bombarded with things and what to do. So those are the 4 big areas that are going to be looked at in terms of the assessment. So you or the school can request the EHC plan, and AFC, which is the kind of local authority, both Kingston and Richmond, has got a form for that can be filled either by yourself or by the school. And then they've got 6 weeks to decide whether or not they're going to carry out an assessment. Those 6 weeks are quite important, it can be quite lengthy. It may be that the local authority decides not to carry out an assessment. It's quite common, in which case further evidence needs to be gathered. It may be that the parent decides to go to tribunal, and then it's often then when that happens, the local authority may reconsider and actually change that decision and carry out with the assessment. But it may be that they think it's not the case. But you have this possibility. So 6 weeks from the request. But very often in our experience, the work that happens prior to the request, what Mandy was talking about, can last a very, very long time, because it's the work of actually getting the school to recognize that there are special educational needs and putting it. And if you don't do that, if there is not that evidence, then what the local authority does is that it says, well, actually, and you use, the school hasn't made reasonable adjustments, so you go back to the school. So it's kind of quite a Yeah, that's why it's a lengthy process. Then, if the local authority decides to assess, there is 6-week process where an educational psychologist will be consulted, you yourself as the parent will be consulted, a medical professional is consulted, social services have to be consulted, anybody that the parent reasonably requests. So it may be speech and language therapy is very important, occupational therapy as well. So that may come in. And then, once the assessment is carried out, then there is another time when the local authority decides whether or not they're going to carry forward. It's not that very rare where they decide no, but they still have the possibility. So they decide whether or not an education, health and care plan is needed. And then the plan is drafted. There is what's called a multi-agency meeting. You may have heard of it. That kind of drafts the plan. The plan then goes to panel because the local authority has to formally agree that they're going to, because they'll be responsible for the provision that's in the plan. So actually it's quite an important step. So the panel, agrees to the plan or not. And then, after that, then there is a question of placement, which is another interesting time. But then the school, so the local authority will talk to different schools, first within their own budget, and then if they cannot meet the needs of that plan within their own school, within maintained provision, then they go further out geographically and also within the independent sector. But first, it's public money, they've got a duty to use, public money properly. And then the final plan is issued, and with that comes the right of appeal. The right of appeal to the SEN or mediation. Does anybody know about mediation? Mediation is a quasi-legal process that is a coming together of both parties that have a disagreement on something to go and look out for a solution. And so it was put in place at those key moments whether or not to assess, whether to issue the plan, and at the end of the final plan, because when the statement, the statement of special need were kind of moved on, one of the big things that came out from the consultations were that actually the system is very, very confrontational, and so the government was looking for ways to kind of stop a little bit that confrontation, because I'm sure you know, and it's still the case, parents have to fight for that's kind of, so this was put there. So kids provide the mediation for the whole of local authorities within London. So you can contact them as well, and then every local authority has to have a mediation service. So either tribunal or mediation, if the local authority refuses to assess, if the local authority refuses to issue the plan, and then again at the end of the final plan.
The local authority should have, has an SEN strategy, and within that strategy, they should be, looking at the provision that's available in the area. I'd look at any shortcomings in that area. I know there are a few schools that are being set up, or schools that are extended in the area, but ADHD is one of those type of diagnosis where the provision is really, really short. So I think actually, in terms of, if that's the case, if there is the need, then the local authority really, really needs to know about that, And the local authority will do that, they recognize there isn't enough provision. There is a shortage of provision nationally, especially here. The only thing I can tell you, there is, you can influence, the SEN strategy. I think it's been set up now for the next few years within the AFC. I think until 2017, 2018, the new strategy. And talk to your councillors, and at the moment the provision isn't there, so the local authority will go out of borough, will go in the independent sector to place the children and young people whose needs can't be met within what's available in the borough.